Good afternoon, everyone. In late 2017, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, due to a bunch of conflicts that we were having with catfish, decided that we needed a catfish management plan. And so a committee was formed, and over about a year and a half, this management plan was created. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I titled it Managing Catfish and People in an Ever-Changing Invasive Catfish World. I don't think this is working. No, that's not working. So I'll talk a little bit about the background of the plan, the goals of the plan, strategies to support those goals, and then finally, the bulk of the talk will be about recommendations coming from that plan. So let's talk a little bit about background. We have 16 species of catfish in North Carolina. The three most popular species are the ones that people catch the most, and that's the blue, the channel, and the flathead catfish. We also have 6 bullheads and 7 mad toms scattered throughout the state. One of the first things you'll notice about the plan is that we struggled and talked a lot about what is native, non-native, and invasive, and how to classify those animals. And basically, a native fish, it's really basin dependent in our state, and you'll see more about that later on. A non-native fish is a fish that is obviously not in its native basin, but is not having what we deem a ecological or economical negative impact. Whereas an invasive catfish would be one that is having those kinds of impacts. So our state is split up due to the continental divide. We have interior basin. Why is none of this moving forward? I'm talking, slides going, didn't know this was happening behind me. Hey, Justin, raise your hand and say, nothing's happening behind me. The computer's asleep because of lunch.
It should come up into a different screen. Hang on a second.
And so we wait.
All right, sorry about that.
You're fine. You could have said something. I mean, really, sir.
Yeah, well, it's going on there now, so you should be able to page left, page right.
Okay, cool. Where was I? Okay, so now you can see the state. Surprise, surprise. It's split by the Continental Divide, and on the left side of the state, the western side of the state, in the dark gray, are interior river basins that flow towards the Mississippi. And obviously, on the eastern side of the state, east of the Continental Divide, we have Atlantic river basins that are flowing to the Atlantic Ocean. And depending on where you are in the state, depends on whether you're a native, a non-native, or an invasive fish. If you're in the interior basin, certain river basins that are on that side, a blue catfish or a flathead catfish or channel catfish would be considered native in that basin. But as you cross the Continental Divide and you get into the Atlantic slope, those fish either become native or invasive depending on what's going on. So the management issues at hand are we have this native, non-native, and invasive issues that are going on across particularly the Atlantic slope areas throughout the southeast. As we heard, if you've been down 2 doors down, there's a lot of talk with blue cats. The invasives and the non-natives provide an opportunity because they get big and people like to catch them and people like to eat them. But what happens is our natives decline because of those fish being introduced into those areas. And we have native catfish that have declined. We have sunfish populations that have declined. Our anadromous fishes are eaten by these catfish as well. So to show you some of our declining native catfish, just to focus on them, here's kind of a list of our native species in our state and what's happening with them. We have some that are state endangered and state threatened. We have some that are listed as special concern, which is just kind of right above those threatened and endangered areas. But almost all of our native fishes are identified as species of greatest conservation need through our Wildlife Action Plan. And we have 2 species, the Carolina mad tom and the orange-fin mad tom, that are currently being evaluated for listing with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Another issue is we have very diverse constituents. We have general anglers that just like to go catch catfish or just like to catch fish in general. We have trophy anglers, which has become more increasing, that is the group that is driving catfish angling in North Carolina, are these trophy anglers. Tournaments, we have tournaments now for catfish, where we once didn't have that 20 years ago. We have bow fishers who like to kill every catfish they can shoot. We also have commercial angling that's going on in some of our reservoir populations, and we have other minor constituents as well. So let's talk a little bit about the goals of the plan. First, we want to support our management through science-based research and surveys that we do, which we're currently already doing, but we want to put that in the plan so that is a driver in future years. Second, we want to protect and enhance native catfish where possible. That is becoming more and more difficult due to invasives on the landscape. Third, we want to develop and implement management strategies for invasive catfish. And the final goal is to establish relationships and understand the desires of our constituency. Like I said, it's very diverse. They have a lot of different ideas of what they want catfish to look like in North Carolina. And so we need to learn more and more and listen to them as to what their needs are. So some of the strategies to achieve these goals. First is establishment of population management zones and units, and we'll talk more about that in the recommendations section to explain that to you. Make a priority list to develop research and survey needs so that we know, there we go, sorry, I'm running behind. Make a priority list for research and survey needs so that we know where we need to go in the future with our management and research. We need to have education and outreach to constituents. And finally, conservation of our native catfish where possible. So now we'll talk about the recommendations, and this is the most of the talk. First is establishing population management zones and units. When we sat down and thought about this, we realized that we really could not just kind of use a blanket model for the state. And part of that's because of the continental divide and natives being and invasives, that issue that we talked about earlier. So to explain a little bit of that, we're going to categorize individual waters into appropriate zones and units, and I'll show you those in a minute. But also we need to describe those zones and units to the public so that they understand what kind of management we're going to be doing within those zones and units. So first, we have just two very broad management zones. First is the interior river basins, as I mentioned before, and I mentioned what natives are there. As you come across the Continental Divide, we'll have another zone, and that's the Atlantic River basins. And basically, the only natives in those areas are bullheads and mad toms, and white catfish is a bullhead. It's native to that area as well. And you've seen this map before. So the dark gray is the interior basin zone, the light gray is the Atlantic slope zone. So within that Atlantic slope, within that light gray area, we decided to break it down into management units so that we can manage it a little bit better. The first is a blue catfish management unit, and this is basically reservoirs that contain blue catfish and have contained blue catfish for going on 50 years now. Some of these reservoirs already have regulations, such as a trophy regulation where you can only keep one fish that's greater than 813 millimeters. And we're hoping to increase angling opportunities because these are really the fish that our trophy anglers are really trying to target in those areas. And those are highlighted here in red. So it's basically the lower Catawba reservoirs, the Yadkin PD reservoirs, the lower part of that, and the lower Roanoke reservoirs. The second management unit is an invasive catfish harvest unit, and it sounds just like the title tells it all. We want to get rid of invasive catfish, or at least harvest invasive catfish in that unit as much as possible. And so the focus is to protect native catfish where possible, no harvest restrictions on invasive catfish whatsoever. And the primary goal of that unit is to manage for natives and limit the expansion of invasives in those areas. And so what that is that's all the light gray of the zone. So that's all the other reservoirs that you see, that you don't see, that are mixed into these river basins and all the rivers. And then lastly, the last unit is the native catfish conservation unit. And this unit will change, it'll either expand and contract as we learn more. This is areas where only native catfish exist that we know of. We've done surveys to know that only native catfish exist there. The primary goal is to preserve these units, not let non-natives or invasives get in those areas. And right now, as you can tell, we don't have very much of that. It's the highlighted yellow areas. Most of these are really small coastal rivers that flow directly to the ocean. We're hoping to identify hucks within these larger river basins that are native catfish, such as some of the very upper portions of these streams that have only native catfishes in them, if they do. But that's just going to take time. So another set of recommendations is to conduct research and surveys. We're already doing a lot in our state looking at catfish populations, but we need to do more. There's a lot of populations that we don't know a lot about, and so we need to continue to do that. We need to evaluate regulations that we placed on catfish going on 20 years ago now with blue catfish in reservoirs, whether that's actually working, not working, having the desired effect that constituents want, those kinds of things. We need to conduct a population assessment of catfish in the PD River downstream of Blewett Falls Reservoir. This is the one area in that invasive catfish harvest unit, that light gray area, that actually has a rule on it. And you can only keep 5 catfish per day. And it's predominantly blue catfish that are in that area of the river. There are flatheads there too. So it kind of breaks the rules a little bit to what our management unit is. We need to investigate alternative methods. If you heard Michael Fisk talk earlier, we need to look at other ways besides harvest to try to reduce invasive catfish. That's still out there. Hopefully science will progress. We need to look at understanding commercial fishing in inland fishing waters. We really don't have a grasp of that when it comes to catfish. These are kind of mom and pop groups that come in and set long lines on reservoirs, catch a bunch of catfish, and then they move on after a few weeks to a month, and then they go somewhere else. We've also done an economic study. Well, UNC Wilmington actually did the economic study, which looks at catfish as a focal species. We know catfish are important to anglers in North Carolina. We know it's a big economic driver in our state, but we don't know how much, and this study should show that. The third set of recommendations is to protect native catfishes of North Carolina. We're going to do that in a couple of different ways. The first is develop and implement an education campaign to show people and demonstrate how important these native catfishes are to our state. A lot of people just don't know about them. Most anglers know about bullheads, but they just call them mudcats or whatever. They don't really know the actual species and those kinds of things. They don't know the importance of mad toms as well. And we're going to continue to participate in status assessments. Like I said, we're already looking at 2 mad toms that might be listed with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But on top of that, we've decided to create some rules to protect native catfish. We've designated these 6 species on the list here, if the rules pass, that we'll call them inland game fish. And what that does, it protects them where you can only catch them with hook and line, and it prevents the sale. So you remove the commercial fishing aspect of it for sure. On top of that, we'll create a rule that only allows you to keep 10 of these fish in aggregate per day of the inland game fish catfishes. And finally, we'll create a rule to prohibit the possession of margin mad tom, tadpole mad tom. All the other mad toms are already protected. These 2 are not. And then the final recommendations is emphasize the prevention of invasive catfish introductions. We got to learn how to prevent fish from being moved around. I think everybody in the room knows that. Catfish is not the only fishes that are being moved around. And so we need to develop an outreach campaign to explain to our constituents why we don't need to move blues and flatheads around anymore. And then finally, we're adding blue catfish to the list of species that is unlawful to stock in the state of North Carolina. Flatheads are already on that list. Blue catfish are not. And with that, I'll thank those that were on the Catfish Committee. They're listed here. If you'd like to learn more about the North Carolina Catfish Management Plan, you can go to ncwildlife.org and go to our fishing page, and you will find the plan listed there. You can read it in its entirety. And with that, I'm done. Thank you.
We've got time for several questions.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you guys think that as we move forward, particularly within the Atlantic, the coastal rivers and this invasive sort of removal unit that you have, the harvest unit, that you may consider different approaches in different tributaries, that there may be a spatial component to the, I'm just thinking about like in Georgia, for instance, right, they have a large removal effort in the Satilla, but they actually support a trophy fishery for flatheads in the Altamaha. So they have, is there any evidence that you have different fishing constituents that, is there really strong interest in a flathead trophy fishery in one river versus another?
I don't know if I could break it out down to rivers. I mean, definitely, like, particularly in the Neuse Basin. The Neuse Basin is a place where, in the coastal part of the Neuse, they really would like a flathead trophy fishery. They've pushed for rules for a long time now to do that, and we've resisted that. So yeah, there are definitely different pockets of fishermen and constituents that want different things for sure. And that's part of the plan. It goes in much more detail than I could do here, to try to learn what those are and what we can and cannot do. You know, at some level, we got to call them invasive, and they're invasive, you know, at some level, and not protect them. You know, it's like everything. It's social and biological and a lot of different things going on. And they've been on the landscape now. Flatheads and blues have been on the landscape since the 60s. So not everywhere, but in North Carolina, you know, not everywhere in North Carolina, but parts of them, they've been there since the mid-60s. So most of the people now that are fishing have grown up with them. So they think that's not an invasive fish. That fish has been here since my whole life, you know, kind of thing.
How big is the education effort to convince an angler that blue catfish on one side of the ridge is different than blue catfish on the other side?
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't know that yet. Yeah, that's a good question. It's the portion of the plan that we struggle with the most is the education component, the outreach component, and it deals with the mindset of anglers. I mean, because that's really who we have to overcome when it comes to calling them invasives, are the people that are trophy angling for them in reservoirs. I mean, like for instance, Carr and Gaston, which are Roanoke River reservoirs. You know, they're producing well over 100-pound blue cats. You know, and to say, you know, it's an invasive fish, you know, it's hard. It's a hard thing it's a hard sell, you know, at this point. So we're in the infant stages of that for sure. Yeah, Tom.
Corey, when we're managing ponds for trophy largemouth bass, we try to keep the density down, right? So we can grow a few really big fish. And so it seems to me that the harvest strategy to keep the population densities a little bit lower could actually be compatible with creating a trophy fishery of just a few really big catfish. You think you could convince an angler of that?
No, we haven't been able to convince them of that in any other species. So I don't know why catfish would be any different.